Last week I covered the basics of pension tax in a bit of detail. I'm not proposing on doing that again. I'll post a link to the old
last week's YouTube live in the chat if people want to go over the basics, but just very briefly.
I like to think of pension tax
in terms of the lifetime allowance, which obviously has been abolished now, as a jug which was at 1.8 million, it's now at 1.07 million. And essentially, you could fill that over that, but once you went over that, you'd pay lots of tax on it. And the amount you could put in every year is deduced by a complex formula.
I'm hearing we're getting lots of feedback, so I'm just going to try. Because I've got two microphones
on. Hopefully the audio is a bit better now. So the problem with the problem with the annual allowance essentially is that you've got no control over it because it's deduced not by how much you put in, but by how much your pension growth is above inflation. That started off at 255,000, then went down to 50, and then 40, and then with tapering down to 10, and then 4, and then back up to 10. So it becomes an impossibility to fill this jug in a tax efficient manner. So just need to very briefly cover the taper, because the taper is important in terms of what happens with the remedy. Lots of people have got a bit of a preconception that the taper hasn't really changed, but it has quite a lot. So if we go back to when it was at the beginning of the remedy, it wasn't there at all. It then came in 2016 and brought your annual allowance down from 40 down to £10,000. If your so-called adjusted income was over 150, and basically your adjusted income is your taxable income plus that deemed pension growth. And then in the 2020 budget, they moved everything over to the right by about 20,000. And then in the most recent budget, they raised the general limit from 40 to 60. And then you can see that there's that longer arrow coming down where tapering over happens over a bigger period. So the amount of adjusted income you could earn is significantly higher than when it all came in. So we do just need to go back in history a little bit to talk about Hutton and all the changes that were made to our pension. So essentially the previous government decided that pensions were a little bit too expensive. We were all living longer. So Lord Hutton, during the coalition government, decided that final salary pensions with a fixed pension age were no longer affordable. So we moved over to so-called care pensions, that's career average revalued earnings. And because of the issue of longevity was the key driver of that, we were living longer rather than it being a fixed pension age. The government then had a moving target of state pension age. And because of those two things, they were able to give a so-called 25-year guarantee that they wouldn't meddle with our pensions again. There's also this horrendously complex thing called the cost cap, which I'm not going to go into, but essentially, if you read certain elements of the media, every week it implies that our pensions are becoming much more expensive, but that's just simply not the case. The cost cap guarantees that it stays within a certain cost envelope and stays fair to the taxpayers and to workers, so that the benefits adjust, so that cost really doesn't move. So we do just need to kind of understand what McCloud is, and this is kind of McCloud on a page, if you like. So essentially McCloud is split into two bits. You've got the what happens when you retire bit, and there's the what happens now bit. So the what happens when you retire bit is on the top. So before 2015, we were all in our legacy schemes. So we were all in either the 1995 final salary scheme or the 2008 scheme. After 2002, everyone was in the new reformed 2015 scheme. And when you retire, so this isn't for now. When you retire, you're going to decide whether or not you want it back in your old legacy scheme or the new 2015 scheme. And everyone kind of prejudges that and thinks that they want to go back into the old scheme. But I would just wait till you've got the numbers, because you may be surprised it doesn't turn out the way that you think it is. But government had to do something now, because the courts determined that the scheme was discriminatory, and so they had to remove that discrimination, and they removed that discrimination by rolling everybody back for this 7-year period initially into their pre-existing legacy scheme. And that gets very complicated, particularly for people that paid pension tax. So you've got these 7 years here, and as I showed you on that taper graph, lots changed in that 7 years. So 15, 16, there was no taper. We then had the original taper with levels of income at 110, which was very close to median GP and median consultant earnings. So lots of people were affected because lots of people were downing tools. In 1920 in England and Wales, we had the AA compensation scheme. And then post-budget, as I said, everything moved over to the right by 90k. And of course, there have been subsequent changes, further down the line from 23-24. So we've got this 7-year period to deal with, but we crucially need to split this into so-called in-scope or out-of-scope years. And that's basically pre-existing tax legislation allows you to change your tax position in the current year and the previous 4 years. And so that means that these 3 years in the remedy period are so-called in-scope, whereas these are out of scope. And what does that actually mean? Well, what that means is that for an in-scope year, if your AA position gets worse and you've got tax to pay, you've got to pay it. But of course, if there's a refund due, the government will refund you via the existing mechanisms for an in-scope year. For an out-of-scope year, again, if your tax charge went down, the government will give you compensation, is what they're calling that, because they can't do it via the normal tax mechanisms. But if your tax position worsened for an out-of-scope year, the government loses out because there's nothing that they can do for an out-of-scope year. So we've got this kind of 7-year mix of in-scope and out-of-scope years. Of course, for annual allowance, you need to look at carry forward. And so rather than the normal 3 carry forward years, we argued that you needed 5 to get the full carry forward. So that's already a 12-year period. Because all of this took a long time, they had to postpone essentially annual allowance tax in the 22-23 tax year. So no brown envelopes were sent out. And that means that we've all got these 13 years to deal with. And just to make it even more fun for accountants, as well as having to deal with all these 13 years, of which 8 will essentially be active tax years, for most people the deadlines will be the same as the normal 23-24 tax year, which means there's another year to deal with. So it's going to be extraordinarily complex, with more data than has ever been used before for accountants to work out your tax position. So just kind of coming back to that period before, so this is this 5-year period before the tool came out. I was in discussions with the government saying, look, it's not going to work if you just give us 3 years. And they thought that position was incorrect, and it came out. And of course that was incorrect, and so we could show them, and a number of pension experts pointed this out to them, that there was different results from the HMRC compensation calculator than there was from the pre-existing annual allowance calculator. And in this example, the difference was between £4,000 compensation and £9,000 compensation. So I think the message, and it's a message that I've been banging on about for many years. This was a tweet from 2019. It's basically always use at least 7 years. Always go back to the earliest year in the HMRC AA carry forward calculator, which is the 10-11 year. And this was just somebody saying, thank you very much. The tax was £2,500 lower than their financial advisor thought it was going to be. So basically, the message of the story is don't ever just use 3 carry forward years. Always go back as far as possible. So how big is this mess? It's very big. 1 million people in the NHS alone are affected by McCloud. So that's 1 million nurses, porters, physios, radiotherapists, etc. But obviously a subset of that, the higher earners will pay pension tax or will have had a brown envelope at some point. And we think it's probably between 70 and 100,000, probably nearer around the 90,000 that have had a brown envelope in any year of the remedy period or asked for an on-demand statement. So let's just jump in and have a look, if all the technology works, at what a pension saving statement looks like. So let me try and change to this, and then hopefully you can see this now. Hopefully people will have seen that there's this Triage on a page tool, and if you print it out, it's then possible to help you go through the remedial pension saving statement. But I'll just put that to one side for a minute and just talk you through the basics of the statement. So this is the statement, page 1, just a bit of bump about what the annual allowance actually is, without any particularly useful information. Page 2 just says what's in this statement and what's not in this statement. So importantly, you've got the 7 years that they're trying to fix. It's also your normal pension saving statement for the 22-23 tax year. That was the year that was delayed. But importantly, they will send you your 23-24 tax year separately. There was some discussion whether or not that was going to be included in this, but they decided not to put it in there. So that's now going to be in a subsequent year. So then we've got this table on the side, and we can see that we've got all of the new growth and the old growth, and then also on this side you've got existing scheme pays. Now you'll see that I've highlighted a couple of years to show that there's growth in both the old scheme and the new scheme, with the new pension input amounts in both the 21-22 tax year and the 22-23 tax year. And the reason that's important, I've highlighted it, is when you go through the HMRC calculator, it doesn't ask for the individual bits of growth, it just asks for the combined growth. So I think there's going to be a bit of an issue with HMRC being able to automatically do scheme pays for these 2 tax years, and so that's a bit of an unknown at the moment, so we'll just have to keep you posted on what happens. Okay, and then we've just got carry forward years repeated here. And then we've got the opening and closing values, which aren't of great use to most people, but there is relevance to the 15-16 tax year in particular. And if you just pay attention to the closing value is directly related to your pension when it was assessed at that time. So for 1995 pension, closing value is your pension times 19. So if you divide that number by 19, you get what your pension value is at that time. And for something called the lifetime allowance, they have this concept called capital value, which is pension times 23. And therefore, so if you divide that by 19 and times it by 23, you get the capital value of the pension. And essentially, my closing value was 350,000. But if you were lucky enough that it was 826,087 or above, that meant the capital value of your pension was above £1 million. And if you Google lifetime allowance protection IP16, individual protection 16, you're still eligible for that now, and that might of course be relevant with whatever is going to be happening in the budget, and I don't know what's happening in the budget either. Opening closing value is not particularly useful, and then this is the most useful page of all. This is the summary page, and it's particularly useful because you've got the old amounts, you've got the new amounts. These are both the combined amounts, and this is what's asked for in the HMRC calculator. And then you've also got the scheme pays bit. So if we just go through the form for me to see whether or not I would potentially be eligible to be able to reclaim in full the costs of an accountant. Essentially, on this form, I've just recreated what this table is here to try and make it easier for you guys. And you just need to answer these questions. You don't necessarily need to answer all of them, because if you get to 1 and it gets to full submission, you've kind of stopped there, and that's how it works on the Triage tool as well. So essentially, question 1, and most people will know this if they've got the annual allowance t-shirts, but have you paid AA charge in the 7-year period between 15-16 and 21-22? And if you do, that's a full submission. And you can either get that information from here, okay, so I can see, for example, here that I clearly have had annual allowance tax charges, and so that's what this red bit is here. But what this doesn't show me is if I've paid annual allowance cash, and I have paid annual allowance cash as well. And if you've only paid by cash, you're going to need to go back to your submitted tax returns to be able to deduce that. So that was question 1. So if you've paid an AA tax charge, you need to make a full submission, and if you have paid a charge, it's pretty likely you're going to be getting a refund. Question 2 is only relevant for a very small number of people in the NHS scheme, and that is have your contributions changed? And this really only applies to locum GPs that are subject to something called annualisation. And if you're not a locum GP and you've never heard of annualisation, that's almost certainly not relevant to you. So for most people, that's a no. So question 3 relates to if any of your contributions were higher in any of these 7 years. So all you've got to do is look across at these values here in the blue bit on that form and say, are any of these values higher? So I wouldn't have passed this test because all of mine are lower. So 51 becomes 33, 43, 36, 51 becomes 44, 37 becomes 13, and so on and so forth. And it's those lower values that are going to be driving those compensation claims, because the growth generally, but not always, goes down. And then there's a question about the 23-24 tax year, because remember, it's not just the remedy, but it's also what's going on now. So is your 23-24 growth above 40k? So that's this figure here at the top in yellow. So that would have been me. And sorry, let me just reject that call. That would have been me, because that was over 40k, and that means you're required to do a full submission. And then there's also a question about tapering. Obviously, the NHS BSA don't know anything about your income, but if your income was over 190k, your net income was over 190k, that's a full submission. And you'll notice that this 190 figure is different from threshold income of 200, and I suspect that's because the Inland Revenue are concerned that not everyone has got threshold income correct. And so when you go into the calculator, there's detailed questions about personal allowance, gift aid, etc. And so essentially, I think what they're trying to do is make sure that people haven't taken off things in error, or their accountants haven't done it in error, or advisors haven't done it in error, taking off things that don't come off threshold income but do come off income tax and your marginal rate, for example. And question 6 again isn't going to involve that many people, but if you'd bought private pensions, not your NHS pension, after 2015, and if you or your employer had contributed over 4k into a defined contribution, again not your NHS pension, that raises something called the MPAA, or Money Purchase Annual Allowance. Won't affect very many people at all, but again, if that is you, that will require a full submission. And the relevance of any of these ones that are full submission is that if you answer yes to any of those, the way to submit that the government have created is to use this HMRC digital service, and they've said that anybody that uses the full tool can get the full cost of an accountant back, because it's a bit of a nightmare. It's 200 pages long, and so you can claim the cost of an accountant back up to £1,000, including VAT. So I'll just nip back to the slides quickly. So why is this important? So again, I covered this last week, so I'm going to go into much less detail, and you can watch last week's one if you want. But basically, there's 3 reasons why, generally speaking, growth is lower. The first is that it's nothing to do with your contributions, and it's everything to do with your pay and your service. And because our pay went down during the remedy period, it means that in general, the 1995 section of our growth went down, and was also zeroed off because we didn't have negative PIAs then. The second reason is that the scheme accrual is fundamentally different. So the 1995 scheme is 80th, albeit you get it at an earlier pension age, whereas the 2015 is 54th, and so that means that fundamentally you get lower growth, because very unfairly it doesn't look at the age at which you retire. And the last reason kind of comes back to the tapering bit that I showed you before, because both of these, number 1 and number 2, mean that you get lower growth, and then if you were subject to the tapered annual allowance, that lower growth feeds into that as well, and so you get kind of the bonus of lower tapering as well. But this isn't everybody. Some people can have growth that is higher. So, for example, if you have mental health officer status, that will mean that you get double years in that period. So 7 years will become 14, which is great. You get another, an extra 7 years of 1995, but that is going to come with some growth. And the 2008 scheme works differently to this. So the 2008 scheme uses something called reckonable pay. So for people in 2008, you're going to have kind of the triple whammy of having additional growth, and proportionately, because it tends to be younger people in 2008 scheme, it's going to be proportionately higher for those people. You've also got this issue of reckonable pay isn't just based on the best of the last 3 years, it's based on an inflation adjusted for the last 10 years. And so there's therefore a complex interaction with inflation that means it doesn't directly track pay in the same way that the 95 scheme does. And of course, as I said up here, instead of it being 54ths versus 80ths, it's much closer between the 15 scheme and the 2008 scheme, because it's just 54ths versus 60ths. So for all of those reasons, 2008 people may be more likely to see the growth be higher. And of course, pay rises. So the whole kind of point of putting you back was to give you more 95 or 08 service. And so if you had a significant pay rise in that period and you've got more service, that's going to cause high growth. But just remember, if we kind of go back to those in scope and out of scope years, that means if you've got high growth in these first 4 years of the remedy, so years starting 15, 16, 17 and 18, they're out of scope. If you're in England and Wales and you're a clinician, you can also make a late application, be it new or an altered one, to the England and Wales compensation scheme. And it's really only the 2021, 21, 22 tax years that you would be subject to annual allowance. And of course, the 22, 23 tax year is never been assessed. So that's really kind of nothing directly to do with this. If you've got a charge in that year, that's just, you're just finding out about it now because there were no brown envelopes last year. So, what does that mean? It means that for most people that had big tax charges before, they're going to go down. So because all of these numbers went down for me, that's going to mean that, overall my growth was about 70k lower. And I was also subject to the taper in some of those years, and so my tapering was less severe. And so it means that I'm going to get 32k compensation. And I've used the term compensation a bit loosely there, because compensation in HMRC terms is strictly just the bit for the out of scope years. And so I'm using compensation for in scope and out of scope years, but also cash or scheme pays. And the HMRC tool says, I think a little bit misleadingly, that they're going to be compensating the scheme when they're talking about scheme pays, but they really mean that they're compensating you via the scheme. Because if they compensate the scheme, so your scheme pays loan goes down, that means you can have a low reduction in your benefits when you retire, and so ultimately any compensation to the scheme is indirectly going to you. So it's all compensation. And if it's scheme pays, there doesn't need to be any interest to it, because interest doesn't apply so you retire anyway. And if it's cash, you'll get it at the statutory rate of 8%, the interest. So that'll be a decent rate of return. So what do you guys need to actually do? So essentially, it's all about triage. So the tool itself is around 180 to 230 pages, depending on your exact circumstances. But towards the beginning of the tool, you will come across this page that's either going to say you are eligible to use it, which means you failed triage. And if you press continue, you go into the kind of, the scary long bit. But the questions before it, principally are just essentially asking you the same bits that I showed you on here. So it's just these questions here. So essentially, have you ever paid charges during the remedy period 15 to 22? Is your growth above 40k? Does your growth higher in any year? And is your net income higher than 190 in 2023? And you can do that on the form. And if you get to this page, this is the page where you can call for help and essentially be guaranteed to get reimbursement of your costs and get a professional to do it for you. So what help is available? So there's this thing called the cost claim back service, and essentially it's a limited scheme to claim back some costs. So this isn't about claiming back your overpaid tax. That's going to be done through that HMRC digital service, but this is about claiming your costs to help deal with that. And there's essentially two things that I mentioned. So there's £500 to help your decision around retirement, so you can use an IFA for that, and they can help you look at your remedial service statement, which is something I've not talked about today, to decide whether or not you want to keep everything in the old scheme or move it over to the new scheme. And then you can get £1,000, including VAT, at rollback for an accountant or an IFA where the service relates to the use of the digital service. And there's been some further clarification about that on the BSA website. Saying that, you know, if your accountant or IFA does it, then you can claim back that £1,000, including VAT. And as I said, the claims for the tax itself and the changes to scheme pays are going to be dealt with by the HMRC digital service. So who are Forvis Mazars? So there's this thing called ASMA, the Association of Specialist Medical Accountants. It accounts for about half of doctors, accountants in the UK, and they're a large and leading member of ASMA. You know, some of you will have used tools before that I've done on a kind of user-led basis. You know, and whilst I might have liked to have tried to do this on that basis, it's just too complicated, much too complicated, in fact. There's a huge amount of data, and the scope for getting it wrong if you do it yourself it is huge. So hence, I've partnered with a specialist accountant, developed some tools with them to ensure that you get exactly the compensation that is due to you with as little hassle as possible. All the claims get a so-called 4-eye check. So that means that two different qualified accountants will look at all your numbers, and then there's some tools in the middle of it which will help submit it all to the HMRC digital service to make sure that there's no transcription errors, etc. Forvis Mazars will get all the data that they need from a combination of data sources, including the Inland Revenue and the pension scheme, and then submit a claim on your behalf as an agent so that you can get the compensation that you are due. So this is just a quick look at the tool. I'm afraid I'm only going to show it you sped up 20 times because there's no point in showing you a 200-page tool. It's complicated. It's boring, and there's a vast scope for error. In fact, when I was asked to look at this tool with the people developing it, I did it live when the tool was kind of half the length that it is now. It was about 82 pages long at the time, and we went through the tool being, watched by the 10 or 15 developers that were doing it, and they decided. It just took forever to do it, and it's very difficult to get all the bits in the right tax year and not make mistakes. And so that's where the idea to use kind of robotics and automation came. And so basically the service will be an accountant checks all your numbers beforehand. The tool predicts what the output of the HMRC tool should be. It submits it all to the HMRC service. Then a separate accountant looks at the HMRC output and compares it to what the prediction was before, and if that all looks fine, that will all go off to the Inland Revenue. So if you want more information about that service, you can scan the QR on the left, and if you just want to sign up for it and get the service with this 4-eye check and being able to get the cost reimbursed, you can scan this QR. Not wishing to scaremonger, but we believe lots of people have complained. BMA have complained, SPPA have complained, others have complained that the deadlines are frankly too tight for all of this, and so there's a bit of a worry that there's going to be limited capacity in the sector to deal with it. So my strong advice is, there's a number of people that are offering these services, so make a decision who you want to go with, and get signed up early, because as time goes on, capacity in the sector may be limited. So obviously these started landing a week or so ago, and perhaps not entirely unexpectedly, given that we used to see errors on pension saving statements. We're also seeing some errors on remedial pension saving statements. So, for example, this is the England and Wales RPSSs, and even just looking within the RPSS itself, where things are meant to be showing the same numbers. So this, for example, is meant to be the growth for the 14-15 tax year. I've got 43 here and then 13 here. So this has gone down almost 30k. And then similarly, this one for this one has gone up £33,500. So that's obviously a concern that not all of these numbers are definitely right. A further concern for lots of people, myself included, is if you took industrial action, you probably can't access your my NHS pension portal or your TRS at the moment, and again that makes it a little bit more difficult to triangulate all of these numbers as well. So I think that's going to be a bit of a problem. We know that SPPA are delayed, and they're a little bit behind the curve of where England and Wales are, but we have seen some sporadic RPSSs, and again there's some worrying areas on it. So I've not talked about negative pension growth, but basically negative pension growth, as it says on the paragraph at the bottom, was meant to come in the 23-24 tax year, and you can see that this RPSS shows negative growth in the 22-23 tax year, so that's not even a thing, and it can't exist. So SPPA have confirmed, I'm certain, the negative PIA is an error, and HMRC have also confirmed you're right, of course. There is and was never a concept of negative PIAs where the amount is negative. It should be zero, and that ability to offset wasn't available until 23-24. So we don't know how common this error is, because I think there's been very few sent out north of the border, but it's clearly a bit of a concern. Also, just fed a little bit about the content of the SPPA RPSS. It's not quite as rich as the one from England and Wales. So we've suggested that if they are going to change it, to put both split and combined numbers, because the HMRC tool asks you to put in combined numbers. It doesn't show currently pre and post rollback, and obviously if you're trying to work out whether something's gone up or not, it would be great to have pre and post rollback. And it also doesn't include scheme pays, which means potentially people are going to have to start digging through 14 or 20 odd documents to be able to to go through the calculator. So we hope we take that feedback on board and improve things. So penultimately, before we kind of get on to questions, lots of people haven't received them, and some people that have received them, as was the case with pension saving statements, think, am I right to do nothing? So I definitely wouldn't advise people to ignore it. All of this comes under the self-assessment rules. So when you sent, a brown envelope, you're meant to act on the information. Previously some people kind of couldn't get their head round with a pension saving statement the concept of the fact that no one would send them a bill and tell them how much they had to pay. The whole point of self-assessment was, and I don't think it's fair that it isn't self-assessment, because I personally think it's too complicated, but you have to crunch the numbers, or your accountant crunches the numbers, and then you report it via self-assessment and pay the bill, or scheme pays it. So the RPSS analogy is that because it will be going in reverse somewhat, is no one is going to send you a check. So if you're due compensation, the only way you're going to get that compensation is if you do the work, or you get an accountant to do the work, and then you put that claim in. So deadlines are a little bit complicated. It depends on things like whether or not you've already retired, and whether or not you've got any increased tax to pay in any of those in-scope years. But for most people that have previously paid tax and they're due a refund, it's going to be at the earliest 31st of Jan 25. So where are we now? We're 20th of October, so that really isn't a long time at all. And of course, you don't know that you've got any tax to pay until you've crunched the numbers, which is another bit why the deadlines are a bit silly. The deadlines are later by several years if you're only claiming a refund, but as I said, you won't know that until you've looked at the numbers. If you've not received it yet, don't worry about that deadline, because you'll get 3 months from when you put in an RPSS. And we know, well, I've just shown you an SPA statement, but I think the Scottish Pension Agency wrote to people saying that it's going to be closer to April for most people to get these statements. So clearly that's going to push things back a little bit. So, you know, kind of in terms of numbers, you know, we estimate that there's between 70 and 100,000 people going to get one, based on the kind of pay profiles and historic data on how many people get pension saving statements. BSA have said that 57,000 went out in the automated report, and you know, I understand that even with second class post, everyone that was sent one in that should probably have received it. We know that there's a very large number from recent FOI data of GPs in particular that haven't got complete records to 22-23. So if you've not got a complete record till 22-23, you're going to be kind of put in the batch waiting for that data first, because they don't have all the data needed to do all of the tax years that are in an RPSS. And that leaves maybe 10, 11, 12,000 that do have full records but have fallen out because of the need for a manual calculation. And this is kind of really disappointing, because you know, I went up to filed and, you know, spoke to the then chief of NHS pensions in 2020, just before the pandemic, and they assured us that all of this was going to be, you know, within the portal by June 2020. I mean, obviously the COVID came along and that set things back, but then we were promised it was all going to be in there by 21-22. You know, and here we are now, and we're still relying on pieces of paper, and we've got, you know, no idea where we are in the queue, because the undertaking that we got at that time back in 2020 was that if it wasn't in there, if your pension saving statement wasn't there, it would state a reason for not being in there. So, for example, you know, waiting for data from PCSE or from your employer, or requiring manual calculation. So the upshot of that is that, you know, given that deadlines are pretty tight now, I think if you have paid AA and therefore you're likely due compensation, and of course you're then more likely as well to have a charge in 22-23, I probably would now send an email or a DM on their social media asking for your RPSS or a reason why it's not being produced. Then at least you should find out whether or not you're in that tranche that it should have gone, and you know, they can email it you if it's not received, because obviously the post always isn't 100% reliable, or you're in the manual calculation queue, or you're in the queue that they're not able to do anything at the moment because you've got missing data, and that's particularly going to affect GPs. We haven't yet been given timelines of people that are on manual calcs, so we don't really know who that's going to be. But you know, of course, the worst affected group potentially going to be those GPs with missing years, because if you've got missing years data, you know, that's been a long-standing problem, and so who knows when all of that is going to be resolved. You know, so obviously people just need to check their record, and if they've got gaps in it, try and work with Capita to try and get their record fixed and get those missing years fixed. I think it is going to be a problem for some people, you know, who want to kind of plan what to do this year and things like overtime, etc. if you're close to tapered limits, because you really need to know the information both in your RPSS but also in your 23-24 pension saving statement to know if you've got any headroom available, and so if you put in an on-demand request now, the statutory limit for that is 3 months, and that just leaves very little room until the end of the tax year. So I'm going to try and bring in Andy. I hope it works. So I'm going to change my headset, so hopefully I can hear Andy, and move over the microphone as well. So I'm just going to kill that one.
So hopefully people can still hear me on this headset, and I'll try and bring over a screen with Andy on. So Andy, can you hear me? Might be on mute, Andy. Okay. Well, Andy, well, do you just want to speak and just go through some of the questions? I can hear you, Andy. If you just want to talk through them, or if not, I can go through some of them. I can hear Andy. Can somebody just in the chat just say whether or not they can hear Andy as well? Find the chat. They can't hear Andy.
I've just tried something else, Andy. Do you want to try and speak again?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
No.
It might just be a bit of a delay because I've just turned desktop audio on. They can hear you now, Andy. So fire away, I'll let you do some talking and I'll turn my mic off.
Yeah, okay. So first question, why can't people get a pension extract? Oh. So, Tony, why can't people get a pension extraction? How can they check large 2022-23 figures?
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. Just because of the delay, we might just take one each, Andy. It might be a bit easier. Yeah, so the extracts, I've got a horrendous echo, so I'm just going to turn that bit off.
The extracts have been suspended, and we don't yet have a timeline of when they're going to be back, but clearly people will need them back so that they can see the source data to know whether or not growth is correct or not. That's particularly important because, as I said, lots of people aren't even able to access their My NHS pension portal, particularly people that have taken industrial action. So we hope that that's going to return as soon as possible. Andy, feel free just to take the next question and answer it yourself.
Quite a few questions again about people that haven't got RPSSs and whether you can go ahead with this process. Most importantly, you cannot complete this process until you've got the RPSS, because you have to use the figures that are provided to you by the respective agencies in the different countries. Who doesn't get them at the moment? Well, if you have retired, then you will need to go through a pension choice exercise to start with, and therefore that will be delayed. But retired people have a couple of extra years to do that. GPs, particularly if you have not had your pension record updated to 22-23 via the PCSE system, a lot of people didn't. And even if you have done now, there was a cut-off around about August for transferring the data over to the pensions agency. So it might mean that yours are all delayed as well. And then we have a whole heap of people with manual calculations, and that just means any complications that can occur. For example, GPs who may be in the practitioner scheme may have an employment in a hospital or offer an ICB or something like that. That could cause complications as well. So a lot of people haven't got them. As Tony covered, in Scotland, not many have been sent out, although we are getting in the chat a couple of people in Scotland have received them, although the accuracy of them, as Tony covered, was probably, will have to be looked at. So yeah, still a lot of data out there, still to come through, which is slightly problematic. Again, the big issue seems to be people having some strange figures across the board. Very high charges in 22-23, and some of those errors in the in other years appearing. I guess probably worth emphasising, and probably Tony might want to jump in at this point as well, in terms of the compensation that has been set out at the moment is for dealing with this process and submitting the forms and submitting the backdated tax claims. What the compensation process doesn't do is actually deal with sorting out underlying differences. which is, a bit difficult, really, particularly if you don't actually understand the figures. Tony, have you got any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, Andy. Obviously, we're reliant on the scheme administrator providing accurate data, and that's particularly important because the deadlines are so tight. We were hoping that we were going to start seeing RPSSs back in April, which would have given the sector, 9 or 10 months to deal with this. We now find ourselves, 3 months and 1 week away from the deadline for most people. We've got the underlying data extract currently suspended. It makes it extremely difficult for people to be able to process that data other than the data that they've been sent. And, as I've said to government all along, the caps that they've put on this advice are really low. So, people could have easily paid, £1, £2, or even £3,000 getting pension advice. Just looking at a single point in time, and this is looking at 8 years. So I think those more complicated problems are necessarily going to need higher claims, and I think the government are aware that that's the case, and we're just going to have to see how that's dealt with for those more complicated cases, particularly where the scheme have made an error, and those errors need correcting. And the rules of the scheme are £1,000 per piece of advice, so people need additional advice to get their records fixed. Once the extracts are all available, etc., governments are going to need to react to that so people can make sure that they get the correct compensation.
Yeah. One of the questions that did come up in the chat is actually one we debated earlier in the week, Tony. And this is a case where someone's got their RPSS. They've had a look at it, and for all years up to 21, 22, they didn't pay annual allowance tax, and they're not paying annual allowance tax per this process. So you'd expect them, therefore, to be outside the process. But for 22, 23 year, they've got growth in excess of 40,000. But with the cumulative brought forward allowances available, they still wouldn't need to pay tax, but they have gone over that 40,000 in 22, 23. So, the discussion we had early in the week was Triage, I think, points to the fact that they should go for a full submission. But the reality is there's no tax to pay, which to me just seems not a pragmatic, sensible solution. But there's a lot of not sensible solutions in all of this. Have you got any comments?
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? We didn't write this process, and we didn't create this monster of an HMRC tool, and this is the process that the government have put in place for us to be able to respond to these brown envelopes and the data that's in them. I think the challenge is that governments have made available a compensation scheme so that people can access professional advice at a very complex period, and they've tried to minimise their exposure to compensation by making it the high risk people, and they've decided what those criteria are for high risk people, and the correct method to report that you do have a charge or don't have a charge is the HMRC digital service. So it's difficult, and of course the other challenge is that kind of if people do it themselves, then they potentially will get costs in having to do that aren't compensable if they don't do it using the HMRC digital tool. So it's a difficult one to answer definitively, but this is the process that the government have put in place.
Yeah. I mean, as it stands at the moment, we've got a 31st of January 2025 deadline. Apologies in the chat earlier. I missed 10 years out. I was still in the last decade, but did correct that. So we've got the first deadline of 31st of January 2025, which is for people that have a tax charge under this system, albeit if you haven't got an RPSS, you've got a 3-month deadline from the receipt of the letter. At the moment, obviously, we multiple agencies are trying to persuade government to move that deadline, because I think it's, as he pointed out earlier, it's increasingly going to be very, very difficult to deal with all these. In terms of the downside to missing that deadline, from my view, the downside is a risk around interest charges and penalties. I would suspect penalties wouldn't be an issue, but interest charges on late payment tax could be, which then would throw up actually, well, this is another compensation claim, isn't it? Because this is another cost of dealing with a poor process that's not working. You know, it is a risk, but it's going to have to be managed. But I suspect they will change the deadline. And then you've got a second deadline around scheme pays elections, that if you're going for the scheme pays option, if you've got more tax, which will be back to 31st of July. And again, I would hope a bit of pragmatic change on that.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, Andy. You know, I think some people have speculated that it's a foregone conclusion that HMRC are going to extend the deadlines. I think I'm less confident. I'm not so sure they will. I think they should extend the deadlines, but whether or not they will is a different matter. I think perhaps more likely than formally extending the deadline, they may just choose to relax either penalties or interest rather than moving the deadline, because moving the deadline might require kind of new processes, given that 22-23 was taken out of self-assessment, and I'm sure what they wouldn't want to do is you know, delay any self-assessment further. So, you know, it's all speculation, and we just have to wait and see what the government decides to do.
Okay, yeah. So is it worth just commenting again on 23-24 as well? Because getting a lot of in the chat in terms of people need to complete their 23-24 tax returns, but no one's had any data, as far as I'm aware, PSS data in any country at the moment, and what they should do in that situation.
Yeah, so some people have received 23-24 PSSs, and it was actually one of the things that was in the, if I just go back to the Scottish Pension Savings Statement, if that's going to work. If I just move over to here, so that was actually in this 23-24 bit. Actually is there, so that does have a negative PIA, so who knows, that might be correct. But you know, I know that I've certainly asked 3 times for my 23-24 PSS, and on not a single time have they actually addressed that I've asked for it, and but I know other people have been told that things like there is no timeline for these requests, which is a bit ridiculous, because of course there's a statutory deadline of 3 months for dealing with a request on demand for a PSS. What I would say is that people that are used to getting brown envelopes every year and paying this horrendous tax might not get a standard one for 2 reasons, and those 2 reasons are, and this is not for GPs but more for officers, is that obviously the annual allowance has widened from 40 to 60,000, and they only send it when you've exceeded general annual allowance. But of course, you know, as we can see from this person's RPSS, they've got, you know, negative growth of minus 35k in 23-24, so that's going to offset their 15 growth. So the vast majority of people, including myself, I've not got my paper, but I know what is going to be on my paper. So I'm expecting it to be, you know, very much below the annual allowance of 60. So actually, it's going to be the first year in many years that I'm going to generate some carry forward. But before people kind of celebrate that they've got a load of carry forward and everything is fine, we've got to remember that we're currently in the 24-25 tax year, and for lots of people who've had significant pay awards, I won't say pay rises, I like to think of it more of partial pay restoration, but it has been significantly above inflation, and so there's going to be some really, really big pension growth figures for the 24-25 tax year, and for people potentially who are going to taper, that could all end in tears, even if they get £40,000-50,000 of carry forward from the 23-24 tax year.
Okay. So someone's raised a question, and it's quite a legitimate question around coping with the capacity and having capacity to deal with all of this in the accountancy sector. So the problem we've had is the across the board there, and this isn't just me talking, this is, you know, talking to lots of other people that are doing this. And I work with lots of accountants and lots of great IFAs who are and other people who are working in this sector. The problem is we've had all this information really late, and, you know, again, the chat has said, there are so many people that have got queries about the quality of the data coming through. Now, you know, is there a sufficient capacity to deal with this in the marketplace if everyone has to submit by the 31st of January? Probably at the moment, I'll be honest with you and say across the sector, no. I think we're all trying our best to do as much as possible. All you can do if you're looking for help is try and get the help that's out there. You know, we are triaging in our firm's approach is to triage people as best as possible. At the moment, we're triaging those that have got RPSSs, because they're the people that can actually kick off this process. A lot of people that have signed up haven't got RPSSs, so they are in the kind of next wave as and when we receive them. So we're triaging that, and then we'll try and sort of work down from that process to try and identify people with tax charges and start to deal with those as a priority. But those who may be in a refund situation where you still to continue to accrue interest on refunds, you know, you may be left to slightly later because you don't have to worry about paying tax. But it's going to be challenging. It is going to be extremely challenging at the moment.
I think just to add to that, Andy, the other group that I think might not have heard back if they've registered is people who've previously opted out. And you'll note both last week and this week, I very deliberately didn't talk about contingent decisions. And that's because it's a little bit of an unknown quantity. So we know a little bit from the regulations. For example, anybody that opted out or stopped added years contracts between October 2014 and April 2022 will be able to buy back that service. But we don't know exactly what that's going to look like yet. And until we do know what that's going to look like and how that fits in with this compensation process and people getting refunds, we're just holding off. And hopefully we'll know a little bit more over the coming weeks. What I would say is that that's also going to require data extracts from another party, from ESR, and at the moment that extract doesn't work. And so, you know, it's not going to be solved immediately what's happened with that group. So we will be in touch with people as soon as we can, once we know what the rules look like.
Yeah. Okay. I think given the time, we're up to just 9:05 now. So this was only planned for an hour. We have answered as many questions as possible, I think, in the chat, and just live trying to cover some of the key ones. I know there might be specific questions in there about actually completing the actual claim in terms of what goes in which box. I don't think on a web, you know, a webinar like this, we can actually sort of do that because everyone's circumstances are different. So apologies if we haven't answered your questions there. Tony, do you want to wrap up at all?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for helping, Andy. I'll just go to the closing slide or the beginning slide again. That's got the QR codes. So it's all a bit of a mess, but there is help out there. If people want to know more about the service, that's the link on the left-hand side. If people just want to get their place in the queue and register without any commitment, that's the second QR on the right. I would just say that all of this is evolving. You know, the issues of kind of errors and information and extracts, it changed very much from this week to last week, and I'm sure the position is going to be different next week again. So we'll try and put as many of these lives and webinars on as possible to keep everybody posted. But above all, you know, try not to have nightmares about pension tax and brown envelopes. You know, for the first time, you know, unlike normal pension saving statements and annual allowance, there is help available that's compensable from the government. So take the government up on that offer and try and take the stress out of the process as much as possible. And obviously just thanks to you, Andy. Andy knows, I think, he's a bit of a legend, and I've worked with him quite a lot over the last 5 years, and so thanks very much for joining us tonight and helping out.
Yeah, and thanks very much, everyone.
Cheers all. Bye now.